and welcome to our course on marketing management part 1. This is week 3rd. We are talking about capturing market insight, and this is the concluding session of this week 3, where we will be talking about the exploratory marketing research. So, till now what we have discussed in this marketing research process is that we looked into the different stages of this process, that is management decision problem, marketing research problem and objectives, then research design part, then data collection part, analysis of that data, reporting of the findings that goes as an input into the decision making process of the marketing managers. Then we talked about the relationship between management decision problem and marketing research problem, followed by the research discussion on the research design. So, we were talking about the different types of research design, the exploratory research design and the conclusive research design. And in exploratory research design, what we have talked till now is about the secondary types of data collection, that is from the literature review or the publicly available data. And then we started talking about the primary data collection in the exploratory research design, and we talked about two prominent techniques, that is focus group discussion and depth interviews. The focus group discussion involves a discussion of 8 to 12 pre-screened homogeneous type of respondents, which are kept in a basically group setting, and the moderator facilitates the discussion. The role of moderator is very important to encourage the discussion. He should be able to communicate with the respondents, build the credibility with the respondent, so that you get the more insights from the by facilitating or by prompting the discussion among the participants. Then we discussed about the depth interviews, where we talked about why basically depth interviews instead of focus group. So, depth interviews are used where the respondent, by understanding what are the social norms, or by understanding the what is the purpose of the research, or because the issue in hand might be something which might be embarrassing to them, will change their response pattern. So, understanding that, we probably go for, instead of focus group, we go for the depth interviews, probably where the interaction between the interviewer and the respondent is one to one, and it is a face to face interaction, and the respondent can more freely or more conveniently answer issues which he or she cannot talk in the group setting. So, I will go further in this direct exploratory type of research. So, one of the basically very common method in this marketing research is among the exploratory research is ethnography. So, what is ethnography? So, after talking about this focus group interviews and in-depth interviews, I will talk about the ethnography, and then I will also talk briefly about the content analysis. But I will talk before that, I will talk briefly about indirect exploratory research design is mainly in the form of projective techniques, where the respondent does not know the purpose of the research. So, it is projective methods. You will see that they are again unstructured indirect form of probing is employed to encourage respondents to project their underlying motivations, belief, attitudes or feeling regarding the issues of concern. Now, what happens is, unlike the direct methods, where the purpose of the research is known to the respondent do not know the purpose of the method, purpose of the research, and they are asked to basically answer with respect to the third person. So, respondent are asked to interpret the behavior of others. By interpreting the behavior of others, respondent indirectly project their own motivations, belief, attitude or feelings into the situation. Now, the prominent type of the different forms of projective techniques involve the word association. What happens is, you are given a word, and then you are asked like what comes the next, what kind of association comes next into in the minds of the respondent. So, by understanding what kind of association comes in the minds of the respondent, the understanding their responses, you can understand what they think about the probably the subject which are given, and you can understand what kind of association they have with a particular kind of words. Like in this example, you can see that the respondents are given brand names of a couple of carbonated drinks, and some of them are also non-carbonated. There probably by understanding what is their response, you can understand a sort of what kind of positioning they have in the minds of the consumers, or what is the value proposition that a consumer perceives about these brands. Then you have completion techniques, where you give the respondent a sentence and you ask them to complete it, or probably you give them basically a part of a paragraph and then you ask them to complete, and by analyzing that sentence or the paragraph, you are able to understand what basically respondent think about the subject in hand. Then you also have the construction techniques, where probably you provide the pictures, or you provide the cartoons, and then you put them in the context and you ask the respondent to interpret about what they are talking about or what is happening in that setting, and then you try to understand their motivations and beliefs about certain things in basically those kind of settings. After this indirect exploratory research design, I am going to talk to you about one more type of direct method of exploratory one more type of direct exploratory research technique, that is ethnography, which is based on the observations or direct observation of the respondent, that is observations to understand customer in their natural habitat. So, what was happening in the case of focus group and depth interviews, the respondents were not basically present in their actual use of the product or the services which we are trying to understand, or the issues which we are trying to understand, and that can basically conceal or will not reveal certain kind of information which could be very important from the design of the product, or from the marketing aspects of the product, or the kind of positioning or the campaign you are preparing for the product promotion. So, to understand the consumer in terms of its cultural trends, lifestyle factors, attitudes, and the role of social context in choice of product and brands and their uses, ethnography is quite commonly used. What happens in this ethnography is that uses anthropology as its foundation to show how products or services fit into the consumers customers everyday lives. So, what happens in ethnography, which is different from the focus group and the depth interview, is that you try to understand the consumers, the relationship between the consumers and the product, how the consumers are actually using or utilizing the product in their day to day life or in their natural setting. So, how it helps is basically is that it helps you to understand, while the consumers can talk about their they will express their needs which probably are obvious to them, but there will be certain things which they will not be able to understand. So, by utilizing the ethnography, you are able to understand their latent needs also. So, in that case there are different ways in which ethnography is performed, that people shadow the respondent. So, they understand what basically is going on in the life of the respondents. They basically accompany the respondent or the people who are part of their panel, whom they can study. So, they go along with them in the shopping malls and the different places where the people shop. Then there are certain types of ethnography which involves the researchers to go into the kitchen, or they do the cooking observations to understand what is basically is being prepared in the kitchen, how basically it is being prepared, what are the different things what is the setup of the kitchen, how the utensils are used, or I mean how the different products are used. So, that gives the basically a first hand idea about how the products are used in their natural environment and the natural setting. Another type of ethnography involves a day in the life of the consumer or the respondent. So, basically researchers go and live probably for a day in the life of the respondents, and they understand their daily routines, their beliefs, their cultural context and all those things. Also involves the in-home visit. These are different forms of ethnography. What it does is basically help them to understand how the product are consumed in the actual life. So, I will give you a couple of examples of ethnography which will help you to understand that what is the utility of this method. Based on this ethnography, basically this design continuum firm came out with a product design for the Reebok. What they have found in this a group of high school basketballers was that these growing kids, when they were growing, because of their growth, that quite often used to let those shoes too tight or too loose, and that used to hamper their play. So, you can understand when the shoe is not very well fit in the feet of the kids, it will be either tight or it will be very loose, and then it also creates the problem that the parents have to purchase those shoes quite often. So, basically the cost is very high for the parents. And one more problem, because these shoes were loose or probably they were tight, they used to cause a lot of ankle injuries among these kids who used to play the basketball. So, this design firm came with this new design of this Reebok shoe in 1989, wherein you can see that they have created a valve here in the shoes, where probably the air can be pumped and the shoe can be fitted according to the feet need of the person who is wearing the shoes. So, by doing this, they are able to provide a very good fit to the requirement of the player, and you can see that with the growth probably you do not need to with probably the growth you do not need to change your shoe very quickly. So, it has solved the problem. So, what has happened is, though it might cost a bit extra, but overall probably the value being created by this product and overall cost or the saving by purchasing the shoes again and again has reduced the cost of the customers, and it was lot more convenient. It was helping them in avoiding the ankle injuries. So, this is one of the design which they could understand, that this kind of needs they could understand only by understanding when these kids were playing the basketball. So, you can understand that if they would have gone for a focus group or any other method, the respondent might not have told basically these kind of problem like fit or loose or probably the ankle injuries because of this tight or loose thing and the cost which is coming. So, this kind of method ethnography reveals you those kind of things. Another example I will talk about is the P&G, the Procter and Gamble came out with this Swiffer, where they have seen that while people were cleaning their, they have seen the people using mop for cleaning their floors inside the houses, and what they have observed, the researchers have observed, is that people were cleaning their mops as much as they were cleaning their floors. So, what does that means? Like the time you are using the mop to clean the floors, and then you are using that then you are spending a lot of time to basically clean the cloth in the mop. So, the time the overall time was very high for this cleaning process, and it was very inconvenient also to probably certain kind of customers like the old age customers, where the domestic help is not available. So, for them it is basically not a very convenient thing So, P&G came out, their product designer came out based on their this findings that they can reduce basically this the time of cleaning. So, the product designers came out with this, at the bottom you have this tissues, the wet tissues or wet towels, which can be just put around this mop, and it can be then used for the cleaning. And since it is a wet towel, it cleans pretty much as efficiently as probably your the existing type of mop. And then what happens is, once you have once you are done with your cleaning, you can just take out this mop, this towel, wet towel from this mop, and just you can just throw it. So, this kind of solution was very less time consuming for the customers, and you can understand that it will be of great value where probably the domestic help or the labor cost is very high, or the old age people who stay alone, for them probably cleaning and washing their the towels at the bottom or the cloth which is being used at the end of the mop was very painful thing. So, in this way you can see that by the application of the ethnography, the researchers could uncover the unstated needs or the latent needs of the customers, and they can uncover these needs by looking at the product uses in their original settings. So, that is the use of the ethnography. And then one more type of basically another type of exploratory research which is being used is quite often these days used is the content analysis. Because of the advent of the social media, the customers themselves write so much about the products on the web or across the different social media platforms. So, you will see that that data in the form of the text, video and the voice. The marketing researchers can utilize that text, video and voice to come out with the to understand the attitude, beliefs or the behavior of the consumers about different types of the product categories or the different kind of products in the brand. These days these texts are used and the different softwares are used to analyze the text and to understand basically the behavior of the consumers or their beliefs. The video data is being used particularly in the case of the shopping environment, where the how the basically the consumers travel across the shopping malls and all, and how they basically approach and look at the product, what is convenient them to approach, what is inconvenient them to approach, what they would like to purchase, which are the product category they approach first, and then how they basically put the things in their basket, what is their order of putting in these things in their basket, can be analyzed by looking at the videos of the people buying in the shopping mall. And then also you will understand the voice analysis is also used in certain contexts. So, you will see that all these different type of content which comes from the customers can be analyzed to understand the issues which are relevant to the marketeer. So, this basically finishes the different types of techniques that we quite oftenly we quite often use in the marketing research process. And I will end this session here. When we will meet in the next session, we will look into the conclusive research design part, where we will talk about the causal research design, and we will also talk about the descriptive research design. Thank you very much.